I'm a director of product management at T-Mobile. I'm actually part of a newer group there at T-Mobile that is actually developing some really cool new products, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But before I get into T-Mobile specifically, I wanted to give a little bit of background on myself and what I can bring to a class that I teach in particular. So a little bit of my history. I actually started out, as many people do, as an engineer. Actually, my first job was in Japan. Working first at IBM and then eventually at Sony, where I was designing laptops. I did mechanical engineering design for laptops for both of those guys for a while. And then I had this opportunity while I was at Sony to actually transition into product management, because they were like, hey, we want to do this thing that's specific to the US market, and you might have some insights into that, so why don't you help us out? And that kind of led into this opportunity to work in product management. And from there is the rest, and I really have gone back and forth between all kinds of different products and roles. A lot of my experience, though, has centered around actual consumer electronics devices. And that usually includes not just a piece of hardware, but software as well. I did my own startup, that was Glide TV. I launched the first Amazon Fire TV and Fire TV Stick, so I was part of that team. And then from there, I ended up at GoPro, where I led the team that did all the software for GoPro's cameras and desktop software and everything like that. Two more startups later, both of which kind of crashed and burned. And then, now I'm here up in Seattle. All that was mostly down in the Bay Area, where I spent about 11 years. And now I'm here at T-Mobile. And I'm bringing a lot of that experience to T-Mobile because what we're starting to do there is develop our own T-Mobile branded products. And so it's not just a mobile app anymore, it's actually devices. And so we're starting to develop our own unique devices and experiences around that go with those products, specifically for T-Mobile. Because a lot of, especially the IoT space, is an area that you can't just go out and, just like a cell phone, we normally just buy cell phones and then bring it to the store and sell it. Now a lot of these IoT spaces, wearables, things like that we want to get into, there's not the off-the-shelf solution that you can just go and get. And so we're developing some of that ourselves to kind of demonstrate the capabilities of our network, what kind of experiences you can bring to consumers. So that's a little bit of where I've been and what I'm doing now. We often look for people who have a technical background because it does help in certain cases, but we have both what we call technical product managers as well as just product managers, and we hire both. And we may put the technical ones into very specific roles where they're dealing with down in the weeds, the nitty-gritty of the details of a piece of hardware or software even, or back-end systems or something like that. But there's still a lot of experiential kind of things that go with whether it's hardware, or whether it's software. And we bring in product people for that as well. And so, we kind of distinguish your background, your capabilities and experience, and we look at that and say, hey, this we think would be a good fit for this particular role, as opposed to, oh, we're only going to hire technical people. But I don't think it necessarily hurts. I mean, we have people working on both sides that have technical backgrounds and don't have technical backgrounds. There's a few things that I look for. One is, passion for, the customer in particular. Really you want to, an empathy for the customer, because if you're going to build a great product, it's not about what you think or what you experience or things like that. It's about understanding the customer's needs and making sure that you're solving the right problems for the customer and being able to put yourselves in their shoes, really being empathetic for them, understanding your market. Those people who understand that piece is super important, and I look for that whenever I hire someone or whenever I think someone could transition into product management. Someone who talks a lot about the customer and not about like, oh, I think this is going to be awesome because I like it. It's more about like, hey, this is, an understanding. People who want to get out of the office and really understand what the customer's needs are is someone that those are the kind of things that I look for. So the product marketing and product managers, again, it depends on how the company defines it, because I've seen it defined differently at different places. But typically the product marketing person is the one that, the product's been defined, maybe even developed to a certain point. You understand what features are going to go to market, and then it's handed off to the product marketing person, who then is going to craft, how are we going to message that? How are we going to, where are we going to put it? Is it on the website? There's packaging materials that have to go with this, or we're going to do social. They're focused on all of those pieces, and that's, in my mind, typically the product marketing person that's focused on that. The product manager may be involved in making sure that they didn't mess up the message because it changed from, hey, this is the feature set, and then all of a sudden they talk about it differently or something like that. They're involved in that, but the marketing person is focused more on that outbound kind of communication to the customers about the product. In some cases, there's also product marketing people that are more front end. So they're taking and doing market research and collecting data on the market, surveying the market, segmenting the market, understanding opportunities. That's also what people call marketing, product marketing often. And so, I've seen that even be two separate roles. There's outbound and inbound marketing teams that, focus on the front end, and then the tail end, the go-to-market, once the product's ready. In some cases, they're the same person that does both sides. But the product manager is typically involved to some extent throughout that entire process, either talking to the front-end marketing people, saying, hey, what is the market telling us, understanding that, turning that and distilling it down into something that will be a product. And then once it gets to the end of the process, handing it off to the marketing team with go-to-market materials and messaging and things like that. Now, coming back to the project manager, that's more about timelines and schedules and meeting deadlines and meeting milestones and managing things to a particular deliverable or schedule. That's usually their focus. Whereas the product manager is doing a lot of different things, defining things, requirements, getting into the weeds on the development, working with UX, working with developers, and then, as it gets closer to the end, talking about go-to-market activities. I'm a huge fan of trying to iterate and learn with hardware, because this is the big challenge with hardware, is that the costs or the investment into developing hardware ramps up really fast. And you don't want to make mistakes. Once you kind of hit a certain point, you're like, there's no going back. And this is actually what kills startups all the time, who think they can, hey, we're going to do hardware. But there is a lot of things, especially in this day and age, that you can do that helps you avoid certain pitfalls, before you get too far down a path. And a lot of those are no different than what you might think of doing with software. Like with software, even though software is easy to iterate on and prototype, you still do things like paper prototypes, or you do things like simple UX, wireframes to get people's input and feedback and show it to people quickly and learn from that, right? And there's similar things in the hardware world that you can do. We have 3D printers and laser cutters in our office at T-Mobile now, where if we have an idea or a concept, we print it out and then we show it to people and we get immediate feedback, or we try it. If it's something that's a wearable, hey, is this too big? Does this feel weird? It was only the cost of the print. And we can iterate on that every day, with different ideas. And we actually, I think on one product, we did like 40 different versions, and get feedback on those, immediately. And it saves you a massive amount of cost and time. And similarly, now with, there's dev kits and all kinds of hardware stuff that you can take off the shelf. If you want to try an idea, you say, hey, I have an idea, connect this to that and make it do this. You can prototype that in a day. And so what we call looks like prototypes, and then acts like or functional prototypes. And you don't worry about putting them together right away, because that gets more complicated and it takes more time and money. But the looks like and works like are easy to prototype very fast, and you can put those in front of people and get their feedback. It's a little bit of Disney-like magic that we do sometimes, where the guy behind the curtain is. I've even prototyped an entire smart home where we rented out an entire apartment, pretended like we had outfitted the whole thing into this amazing new experience. And it was mostly people behind the curtain just like faking most of it, pushing buttons and doing things, and playing audio sounds when something would happen. But from the person's point of view, it's real, right? They're like, oh, wow, how did that just happen? And it gives you an opportunity to get that immediate feedback without very little investment. You know, we rented an apartment for a day, you know, and that was it. How do we pick the must-haves? Kind of the MVP. Lots of ways, and every company does it slightly different, but typically, you know, some of it's driven by timelines, you know, so that usually is a forcing function. There's resources, there's time, and there's money, and all the, you know, the things that come into play. And then also there's value, right? You know, and that's really the big one for, you know, the customers, like, well, how do they value, you know, each of these features? And what we've done in the past is you do a conjoint study or something like that where you present customers with certain features that have a certain amount of value associated with them and force them to pick against how much that would cost, or the trade-off between those things. Like, you can have this one but not this one, which one would you pick, kind of thing. And it forces them to make decisions in a way that, and I'm not an expert in putting these things together. Usually you work with someone who is, but when the idea is that in the end you get this output that says these features have the highest value, you know, and that lets you know based on customers, target customers that you would talk to or bring in. That gives you an idea of, like, these features are the most valuable. These are the ones they'll pay the most for. This below this line is the next set, and then below this line is the next set, right? And that allows you to know, okay, MVP could be this. I mean, there's probably some just baseline stuff that you have to have in a product that no matter what, and usually those you wouldn't necessarily always include in those kinds of studies, because that'll be noise, you know, that's mixed in. You're like, hey, this has to be able to plug into a TV. Well, that's kind of given. You know, if it's a product that plugs into a TV, it has to do that, right? Those you wouldn't include. It's the bigger features that you want to present to customers, like, you know, especially ones that cost a lot of money to build or cost a lot of resources to build or take the most time. You want to know the trade-offs between those, right? And that's the ones that you want to get in front of a customer and get their feedback on. And then there also, we used to have a formula that we would use at GoPro where, you know, to keep it easy for especially new product managers that came in, and not just product managers, but across the organization, we came up with a formula that said, okay, we're going to assign value based on how much does it impact, not just, you know, to the value to the customer, but is it bringing value to our customer support team, because that's expensive, you know, or does it add cost to them, or does it, you know, make something more difficult on our side that adds cost, you know, and then it would kind of come up with a number at the end. And then we would use that to help prioritize and rank features, you know? And that just gave us a simpler way to quickly throw that in, and everyone would rank things, and then you could see it all. As a project manager, I think the biggest challenge is wrangling all the teams, you know, and keeping things on track, really, at the end of the day, especially in the context of if it's a software development effort and it's all internal, that's a little bit easier. In the case, like, of a project that I'm working on, you know, my team's actually working on right now at T-Mobile, I think we have 6 vendors outside plus internal, and we're all trying to hit a certain timeline, and that gets really challenging when you have to manage outside third parties, and they all have their own nuances, and they're all in different countries, actually, you know, in Europe and Asia, and, you know, they're all spread out all over the place, managing time zones. I mean, I don't think we ever get to sleep sometimes, because you get up early in the morning to talk to people in Europe, stay up late at night to talk to people in Asia, you know. So dealing with all of those things is challenging. And a lot of it is about managing risk at the end of the day, because, you know, you have a particular target launch date in mind, perhaps, and you want to hit that date usually. In the world of, T-Mobile's a little different, but in the world of normal consumer electronics, holiday is the date. You know, sometime in the holiday time frame, because that's when 60% of your money is made. If you don't hit that date, you are in big trouble, and so hell or high water, you're going to hit the date. And so then it's about managing risk along the way, of making sure that, hey, are we okay? You know, is there enough buffer? You know, all these types of trade-offs along the way, and that's really the biggest thing. Do product managers code? Yeah, I mean, again, if product managers, a lot of times they come out of that world, they were a developer at one time and then they move into product management. And if you're at a smaller company or a startup, I've had product managers. One of my product managers at GoPro, he wasn't really good at writing like code perhaps, but he was really good at building prototypes that he would use simple means to do that, and they looked amazing. They looked real. Everyone thought it was real even though it was not, but he was good at doing that. And a lot of times that's super valuable to be able to do that, because again, the sooner you can put stuff in front of people, it's actually much easier to communicate even to a developer, hey, this is what I had in mind, as opposed to just a static wireframe, or especially if you're talking about things that move. There's a lot of times apps nowadays and things like that have motion built in. How do you communicate that without actually showing it?
What are the things that candidates should really highlight to really say like, hey, I have the ability and the talent to get there, right? Like to get to the full-fledged backflippers.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you're at now. And this is something that comes up a lot in the product management classes that we teach, because a lot of times the people taking the classes are people who are trying to move into product management. And, they're like, hey, how do I make that transition? How do I make that jump? What I usually tell people is the ideal approach is, if you can, get some experience at the company you're at, because it's easier to get involved in products that expose you to that process and get closer to it, get more involved in it. If you can do that at your company, that's not always the case. Especially if you're project managers and you want to shift over, you're usually already very close to those things. But even if you're in development or other areas, try to do that, because then you can start to highlight those things on a resume. You can start to talk about those things when you go into an interview. That at least maybe get your foot in the door if you want to go transition somewhere else, or if you're lucky enough, transition into it at the company you're at. It's much easier, at least in my experience, what I've seen, it's much easier to make that transition at a company that you're already at than it is to, oh, I'm going to go work for Facebook, as a product manager. Yeah, that's probably not going to happen. I'll be honest. And sometimes people have that, dream that like, I'm going to go to product school, and then when I'm going to get done and get my certificate, and I'm going to go work for Facebook as a product manager. That's tough. Unless you're, you have some amount of experience in doing that already.
Right, and it seems like there is like an unspoken product management framework and all the skills you need to acquire, right? Or here's a portfolio, that's product, that's not product. Would you have any recommendations on where to begin in understanding that framework of skills?
Well, yeah, taking the class, honestly, actually will give you exactly that. I mean, not to pitch the class or anything, but I mean, that's the one thing, having taught the class, that even for me, I was impressed how it goes from start to finish through the entire product lifecycle process. And even as a product manager, sometimes you don't get exposed to that. Sometimes you're kind of, especially if you're early in your career and you're just starting out in product management, they may only give you a small piece of that, and you won't get exposure to all the way from start to finish. Or if you're working on products that are already launched in market and you're just kind of updating and iterating those products, that's just one aspect of product management. Whereas working on something where you're like, I have a concept or I have an idea based on market research and data, taking that into forming our actual product, and then building that product, taking it to market, launching it, and then analyzing the data that you get. That, going through that whole thing, you don't get to do that very often always. And so, that's where the product school exposes you to all of that. And understanding that is super valuable, because then when you go in to talk to someone about product management or go into an interview, you at least understand what they're talking about. If they ask you questions about, well, how do you go about coming up with an idea, or where do you start product? At least you'll have an answer to that because you've been through it, right? And the fact that the product school actually forces you to go through a project along the way, it makes you practice all of those steps. And that's super helpful. Someone just recently came in for an interview at T-Mobile, and they were a retail marketing manager, product manager for Amazon's clothing, I forget what it's called. Wardrobe. Yeah, I mean, that would apply, right? And that's somewhat where you could look for opportunities that are not a huge leap of like, hey, I'm going to go now manage, something very technical or like self-driving cars or something like that, to something that is probably an easier step into, someone who's doing mobile apps for clothing lines or mobile apps. I mean, look for opportunities that help you make that transition, and then from there, hey, now I've done a bunch of mobile apps. Now I can move into something else that's mobile, and then you can start to make that progression into other areas. But trying to go from something that's clothing line to like something that's very technical is going to be extremely difficult, and that I've seen the opposite somewhat be true. Is I had someone in my class in Silicon Valley who literally designed chips for Intel, like the bare chips, and they're like, I want to go work at Facebook, and they're super technical from a technical point of view, but then they want to go work for a big social media company, and how do they make the transition that way? And it's there's probably steps that they can take to get there, but to go from something like that all the way to that is difficult. To make an immediate leap, you kind of have to find your path, to get yourself there. Well, Google owns Nest, who does cameras for homes, and there's mobile apps that go with that. I mean, there's lots, and then Amazon bought Ring, who builds cameras for homes. So there's lots of probably transitions that you could look at that are not that far from what you're doing today that allow you to move into those companies or those opportunities. When you first get into product management, the challenges, I think this is a big misconception about, and I see this a lot with software developers. They're like, I'm going to go into, because software developers work with product owners or product managers, and they think they understand what their job is. They're like, oh, I know what a product manager does. I can totally do that job. Often the thing that they don't see is all the other stuff the product manager does when they're not in those stand-ups and the meetings talking about user stories and points and all that. Like, there's a lot of other things that product managers, and that's again where the class exposes you to the full aspect of product management. And I actually had one of my students who was a software developer take the class, and afterwards he's like, you know what? I never want to be a product manager. Because he didn't realize all the other pieces. And product management is not just product management, it's people management. And it's not just managing developers and the nuances of dealing with developers. It's dealing with UX people. It's dealing with marketing people. It's dealing with business analysts. It's dealing with senior executives. It's dealing with all these other people. It's ambiguity, trade-offs all the time, making decisions. Until you get exposed to all of that, because those are the things that the developers don't see. They see that one interaction with the product manager. They don't see all the other stuff that they're dealing with on a daily basis. And that's the part that when you see that and get exposed to it, sometimes it feels completely overwhelming. And I felt that as well. The first time I stepped in, I'm like, oh, great, I'm going to get to design my product and come up with all the requirements. It's going to be me. And then I started to have to deal with all these people. I'm like, oh my God. It's like, man, I don't know if I want to deal with all this. And constant debates, and with all, not just, when you're an engineer, you're just debating with the one person, the product manager or whoever, right? When you're the product manager, you're debating with everybody. You get feedback from all sides. And if you're not good at managing that feedback, taking it in, distilling it down, understanding how to turn that into, how do I make a trade-off decision? How do I incorporate what's most important for the customer back in? Especially if you have products that, have exposure all the way up to the CEO level. Like we showed Fire TV to Jeff Bezos all the time. And you have to take that feedback in, and you're like, well, can I say no? Do I have to do that? How do I deal with that? I mean, those are the kind of things that you have to deal with, right? And those are the parts that if you're not, speaking of skills that a product manager needs, people skills is another one. So in addition to empathy for the customer, I should have mentioned communication skills and people management skills and presentation skills and some of those things. There's some of those soft skills that are super valuable and important as a product manager that sometimes get overlooked and missed on just a resume that says, hey, I've done all these things, or I've done that, I know how to do it. I often, when I was interviewing or bringing people in for an interview for product management, I had them do homework where they would have to go off, create a presentation, and I did that for 2 reasons. Because I want to see how they communicate, because when they come in, they have to present it to the whole team. I want to see how they communicate that. I want to see how they can present, because if I'm going to put this person at some point in front of the executives, I want to know they can handle that and present. I want to know that they can deal with engineers. I want to know that they can deal with UX people. Like, those are the soft skills that often are missed, sometimes. But they're super important, and they're not easily, from day one, you may not have those, you may have them, but sometimes you have to build those up, and you have to build up a tolerance for feedback, and how to manage feedback is another big one. So actually, I started at a big company originally, a long time ago. I mean, Sony's a massive company. Like, I think when I was there, it was 150,000 people. And then I went to a startup, and then I went back kind of to a bigger company. So I've been back and forth, and so I feel comfortable in both. I really enjoy startups, but there's downsides to startups too if they survive, being one of them. But then, big companies has its whole set of challenges, right? I think we've kind of carved out, the one thing I love about T-Mobile right now is we've carved out our own little sort of ability to act kind of like a startup and move faster, even though it's a big company. So that's nice. In terms of vision and strategy and long-term, I mean, I look for inspiration, in some of it from data. I look at tons of data often, or if you have it. Sometimes you don't always have the data if you're going into an area or a direction that's new. There isn't a lot of market data, but that's always a good place to start if you have access to it. The one thing about Amazon that was great is they sit on mountains of data. So you can just like, oh yeah, let me look at that. So that's one. Another though is just observation. I mean, people often refer to product managers or good product managers as sort of an anthropologist. You just got to go out and see what are those things that, if you have an idea or just look for inspiration. That's why I tell people to get outside, because sitting in an office all day looking at a screen is not going to probably give you the inspiration you need for ideas. And it's usually outside where you're like being exposed to challenges and things and watching people. Sometimes you can just sit and watch people and you're like, oh man, look at that. They're struggling with something. There's probably an opportunity there, right? Or even, yourself, sometimes your own daily life, just be observant of things and, get inspiration from those as well. And then kind of project out, like, what does that mean? Because sometimes I've had lots of ideas that I test out, because having done my own startup before, what I do is if I come across an idea, I'm like, oh, maybe there's an opportunity there, but I don't know. And so I will validate it, one, for myself, and then I'll validate it. If that works, then I'll validate it with other people by building prototypes and doing things like that and getting it in front of people. But then sometimes you realize, oh, the market's not ready or the technology's not ready. Something's gonna have to be this big when I really want it this big. Maybe that's a 3-year plan, because eventually the technology catches up. It's like tablets, right? Tablets existed back in '96, I think. Where you could write on them and everything. IBM, when I was there, had tablets. Handwriting and everything. But it was like this thick and huge, and battery lasted like 30 minutes, I mean, the technology wasn't ready, right? Now, and tablets came out again many years later, and all of a sudden it was a big deal. Sometimes the technology is, it's just not ready, and so you have to wait. And that's sometimes what drives your roadmap and vision and things like that. I think it's one aspect of the technical side that's valuable. I think is valuable is in terms of being able to understand the conversations and the lingo, and even in talking with developers, right? When you're talking with software developers, and they start talking about architecture and layouts, and they're like, oh, we're going to build this kind of database, we're going to hook it up to Kubernetes and then do all these things. And like, if you at least understand it, you don't have to, you're not defining it, you know, but at least if you understand what they're talking about and how it works, somewhat and how it works, you can, I always say I want to be able to know enough to push back when I think it makes sense to push back. Because sometimes they'll be like, oh, that's going to take 8 months. And you're like, are you sure about that? You know, let's talk about why you think it's going to take 8 months. And then push, because how do you know unless you know just enough about the technology? Otherwise, you're going to be in this position of, they're not always going to say, hey, we're just going to, this is what it takes, and you just have to go along with it. There's definitely opportunities to shift over into product management and have abilities to, you know, fit in terms of building experiences, building product, you know, developing product experience. And I don't think that it matters whether it's consumer facing or, you know, B2B. I mean, there's usually some consumer aspect to it, right? And often those people understand, you know, and can empathize a little more with the customer because they've been closer to the customer. Especially, you know, people who have done marketing, right? They're usually closer to the customer. And people who have done the business piece, you know, again, they're good at communicating internally with stakeholders because you're always having to deal with that. Those are all valuable traits that I think can apply. And I think it doesn't necessarily matter as much the product, as long as, again, you can understand the product enough that you can talk to the people who are actually doing the work. And some of that is very learnable, right? Like, you spend enough time with developers. What I've seen happen, though, sometimes with people who come from that side is they kind of like, you know, the developers will just take care of it, and they don't go talk with the developers. They don't get to know the developers. They don't get to talk to them enough to understand what's going on. They just kind of leave it to them. And that can be dangerous, I think, you know, because a lot of times you don't, you know, it's good to build a rapport with, you know, your development team, spend time with them. I've seen sometimes when people transition into product management that way, they want to spend more time talking to the C-suite. They want to spend more time on that stuff as opposed to talking to the developers, and then you may get a product you don't like. You know, and that's dangerous as well. Or they'll just do, you know, they'll say, yeah, it takes 8 months, and you'll just have to go along with it. You can't, you know, you're not there knowing what's really going on. I mean, when we hire people, it depends on, again, if we're hiring a technical product manager, I expect them to have some domain knowledge in that space. If it's, hey, we need to build a mobile app for something, I think that's the skills to understand how to build a great mobile app experience are transferable regardless somewhat of the domain knowledge. And so sometimes you can bring someone in that, you know, hasn't done a banking app, you know, or has done a banking and then they wanted to move into something else, right? I mean, some of that transfers. I mean, I'll be honest though, like when you're hiring and if you have one head count to, you know, to hire against, I'll probably pick someone who's the more experienced one, so then I don't have to train or educate them on the process, right? I mean, that's just the honest truth about hiring, right? Now, if I had like, hey, I'm going to build a team of like 3 or 4 product managers and we're going to, you know, run a product line or something, then I can like bring in some people who may have the domain knowledge, or there's already an existing people that have the domain knowledge, and then you can bring in some people that can learn. Because we have people on our team now that came from completely different. They were working on an HR project at Amazon, and now they're working on something completely different. But he's doing an amazing job, you know. And so the skill, you know, just this approach to product management, you know, for him it worked really well. But it was a mobile app, right? You know, it's mobile experience and stuff like that. And so some of that just transfers, right? You don't need to be an expert in the domain. And sometimes when you're bringing in someone into a domain that's brand new, how many people are going to have the experience? I had 0 experience in the last startup I was at was a autonomous delivery vehicle, right? Like I had 0 experience in that myself. And, you know, but there's a customer experience associated with, you know, dealing with robots and things like that, right? They wanted someone who can approach it that way. And I had to learn about, you know, what it means to build a self-driving car. I had never done that before. All those guys, all the founders had, but you know, so I think if you're looking for certain types of skills, you know, a lot of that transfers. you look at opportunities and ways to leverage certain strengths, right? In our case, in the case of, this is true of Amazon, they have a massive online presence. In the case of T-Mobile, we have, if you add T-Mobile and Metro, it's like 1,500 stores, 15,000 stores, something like that. It's a lot of stores, right? We have a huge footprint in retail. And then we have a sales force in retail that can help push that product. And huge advantages there that we can go straight from the guy who manufactured it for us to the retail store and cut out all the middlemen, right? And there's advantages in doing that. And then we make money off of the service as opposed to trying to make money off the hardware. And that's the way Amazon has approached hardware as well, right? It's like, we're not trying to make money off the hardware. In some cases, they make zero because they know that once you have it, you're going to buy a bunch of other things, you know, or you're going to buy more from Amazon, right? And that's the big advantage they have, right? And for T-Mobile, the service is where all the money's made, you know. And so, not that we would lose money on hardware, but you know, we make money in different ways, and that's an advantage that it's hard for other people to replicate, right? A retail presence and another way to make money, generate service revenue is two big advantages that companies have over like a startup or something like that. So I'll be frank, I have never done B2B. Not that I didn't. Well, not really that I want to, but I've just never had the opportunity to go into that space. Actually, the startup I did prior, the last two startups were sort of B2B to C. So there's still an end customer ultimately, but the product was actually being built for another, a business partner that we were selling to that ultimately the end customer would use. But I think there's depends on the type of B2B product. Like if there's a SaaS product, that people are using, that's one thing. But if you're talking about you're building something for really big customers, they tend to drive a lot of the decisions that get made, right? Because you're like, oh, this customer's going to spend a ton of money with us, and we're going to build features specifically for that customer, and just for them, right? And so a lot of your time is spent focusing on just what that one customer wants. Consumer is actually in some ways very difficult because there's so many different customers out there, right? And you have to pick, the segment of the market you're going to go after. What does that segment look like? There's nuances to that. It's not just demographics. It's certain intents that they have, at different times of their life and things like that. Do they have kids? No kids? All these things that factor in. It gets challenging actually to hit it just right. Whereas I think in some ways, and this is just my perception, having not done a lot of B2B product, what I hear though is that it's a lot of it is driven by that big customer. You may build features that are broader, for other customers as well, so that you can not just be stuck or married to one customer, but that's what drives it. And I think that's and there's challenges I think associated with that as well, right? Because you're always making the trade-off, like, do I just want to build that for that one big customer, or do I want to build stuff that other people may want to? And it depends on your resources, depending how much time you have, those type of things.